The entire restaurant froze. Forks hovered halfway to lips, wine glasses stopped mid-air, and even the soft clink of silverware seemed to get swallowed by the sudden, suffocating hush. A dozen suits sat around the long, white-clothed table, but every eye converged on the older waitress standing beside them, on her neat black shirt, her crisp white apron, her calm hands that didn't shake even as a billionaire CEO dangled a folded slip of paper in her face. A slip of paper marked $2M. The CEO leaned back in his chair, legs crossed with the casual arrogance of a man who had never heard the word no. His silver hair gleamed under the warm chandelier lights, and the smirk on his face seemed perfectly sculpted to cut. "So," he said, $2 million. If you can say even one sentence in Arabic." His colleagues erupted into low laughter, tight, mocking, expectant. This was entertainment for them, something to break the monotony of negotiations and corporate rituals. A harmless challenge, a joke at a waitress's expense. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I want to thank you for choosing to watch my channel when there are so many other creators out there. Once again, I sincerely thank you, and I hope you can support me with a subscription and leave a comment with the number 1 after you finish listening to this story. Thank you very much. But the older woman didn't so much as blink. The hush deepened. A pianist somewhere across the room stopped playing mid-note. The manager hovered in the doorway, frozen like a deer that had wandered into oncoming headlights. Every waiter on shift knew Table 12 was dangerous territory tonight, the kind of guests who measured their worth in decimal points and delighted in reminding others of theirs. The waitress, though, stood very still, her posture straight but not stiff, her gaze steady but not confrontational. Her auburn and silver hair was pinned in a practical twist, and the fine wrinkles around her eyes suggested years of early mornings, late nights, and a lifetime spent taking care of others. Her name tag read Mara, simple, unadorned, unnoticed by most, but not unnoticed by the CEO. He had singled her out the moment she'd approached with the menus, perhaps because she looked older than the staff he was used to, perhaps because she didn't rush or stammer or bow her head the way he expected, or perhaps because men like him could smell vulnerability the way wolves sensed a limp. Mara stared at the $2M slip, then at the polished faces around the table. "Sir," she said quietly, "can I take your drink order?" The table erupted again, jeers, snickers, and a dramatic sigh from the CEO's right-hand advisor. "See?" the CEO chuckled. "Not even close. Just bring us the wine list, sweetheart." But something in Mara's face had shifted. Not anger, not humiliation. Something quieter, older. A firmness born of years she didn't brag about and sacrifices she didn't name. And then, without raising her voice, without theatrics, she spoke. A single sentence. In flawlessly pronounced Arabic, the kind of pronunciation that doesn't come from apps or phrasebooks, but from lived life, real conversations, real people. Her tone wasn't showy or defiant. It was calm, precise, perfect. The effect was instantaneous. The laughter died mid-breath. Chairs stilled. 2 of the suits stared at her like she had grown wings. The CEO's smirk vanished completely, replaced by something rigid and unfamiliar: fear, recognition, a memory snapping awake. His spine straightened. Where did you learn that dialect?" he asked, the arrogance leaking out of his voice like a punctured tire. Around them, whispers began to ripple. A busboy dropped a water pitcher. The manager stepped forward and stopped himself, unsure whether to intervene or bow. Mara simply folded her hands in front of her apron. "You asked for a sentence," she said softly. "I gave you one. Not a boast, not a threat, just truth." But the truth was enough to tilt the air. Suddenly, the CEO was no longer the predator in the room. Suddenly, the older waitress wasn't invisible anymore. Suddenly, the balance of power so effortlessly controlled moments earlier had slipped through his fingers, and everyone around the table could feel it, because whatever this woman had just spoken, whatever history her voice carried, whatever story hid behind those steady eyes, it was clear Mara was not at all who they thought she was. The table remained unnervingly silent as Mara lowered her hands to her apron, while the suits exchanged confused glances that betrayed their uncertainty about what they had just heard, and the CEO's face drained of color in a way that suggested her sentence had struck him far deeper than any of his arrogant provocations had intended. The air around them seemed to tighten, as if the entire restaurant were holding its breath, uncertain whether they had witnessed a moment of unexpected brilliance or the beginning of something far more complicated, and the delicate clinking sounds of nearby tables faded into an almost ceremonial quiet. The CEO leaned forward with an expression that balanced discomfort and fascination, studying Mara's face as though he were trying to match her voice to some buried memory of crowded foreign markets or tense negotiation rooms where Arabic dialects weren't parlor tricks, but the difference between understanding and catastrophe. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the earlier mockery he had wielded so casually. "You didn't learn that from a vacation brochure," he murmured, sounding almost cautious, as though he realized too late that he had challenged the wrong person, and the advisors sitting beside him shifted uncomfortably in their tailored suits as the hierarchy of the table subtly rearranged itself without a single chair moving. Mara didn't flinch beneath the sudden scrutiny, yet she didn't gloat or exploit his shaken composure. Instead, she held herself with a quiet dignity shaped by years of shouldering responsibilities that neither this CEO nor any of these sharply dressed executives could begin to imagine. And when she opened her mouth, her voice flowed with the calm steadiness of someone who had weathered many storms long before this one. "I learned it a long time ago, sir," she said, her tone gentle but resolute, as if she were offering a simple fact rather than a triumphant revelation, and her eyes held a depth forged from struggles she no longer felt the need to display publicly. One of the younger executives cleared his throat uncertainly, clearly recalculating how he should speak to her now that she had revealed a skill none of them possessed, and he leaned toward the CEO as if asking silently whether they should continue their meeting or abandon their earlier arrogance entirely. But the CEO held up a hand to silence him, his gaze still locked on Mara, with an intensity that suggested he was reconsidering everything he had assumed about her. "What kind of background do you have?" he asked, though the question contained more apprehension than entitlement, as if he feared the answer might expose his own ignorance more than her humility, and every diner within earshot instinctively leaned forward, because it was obvious they were witnessing the unraveling of a man who believed he was untouchable. Mara drew in a slow breath, weighing how much of her past she wished to reveal to a group that had moments earlier laughed at her existence. And she decided to offer only what was necessary rather than indulge their sudden curiosity, because her life had been shaped by choices and sacrifices far too meaningful to be reduced to a spectacle for wealthy strangers. "I worked with immigrant families for many years," she said carefully, allowing the truth to rise but not overwhelm, "and I translated for people who had no one else to speak for them," which caused a ripple of unexpected respect to wash across several faces at the table as they realized her fluency was not a party trick but a tool of compassion. The CEO swallowed hard, appearing unsettled by how effortlessly she had dismantled the power dynamic he believed he controlled, and he stared at the slip of paper marked $2M, with something like regret clouding his confident veneer, as though he finally recognized the cruelty embedded in the challenge he had issued with such casual bravado. One of the advisors leaned back slowly, perhaps ashamed of the laughter he had contributed earlier, while another shifted in her seat, as though reconsidering whether her allegiance to the CEO demanded blind complicity in his disrespect, and the tension at the table evolved into something heavier and more reflective. Realizing he needed to reclaim his dignity, yet clearly uncertain how to proceed, the CEO placed both hands on the white tablecloth as if grounding himself before facing a truth he had rarely encountered: that someone beneath his perceived social tier possessed not only a rare skill, but also a moral sturdiness his wealth could not imitate. "I may have misjudged you," he admitted, though his voice trembled faintly with the weight of humility, and the confession hovered in the air like a fragile truce. Neither party had anticipated when the exchange first began. Mara nodded politely but didn't rush to soothe his conscience, because she understood that apologies from men like him meant very little unless their behavior changed afterward, and she refused to let kindness become a doorway through which he could escape accountability. "Everyone misjudges someone sometimes," she replied, with the kind of grace that didn't soften the truth but illuminated it instead, "though it's best to avoid turning those judgments into public challenges," which caused several heads at the table to lower slightly in acknowledgement of her point. Around them, the room slowly regained its ambient hum as diners resumed their conversations with a newfound awareness of the humanity unfolding only a few feet away, and the pianist quietly continued his melody, as though offering a gentle soundtrack to the fragile equilibrium settling over the long table. The CEO looked at Mara with a mixture of gratitude and unease, realizing that she had offered him more dignity in her restraint than he had offered her in his mockery, and for the first time since she approached the table, his expression suggested genuine self-reflection rather than self-importance. Yet, beneath Mara's composed demeanor, an old ache stirred the memory of years spent speaking for people who had fought for survival more fiercely than anyone in this room, and although she stood here now in a crisp black uniform rather than the professional suit she once wore, she carried within her the same strength that had guided her through every chapter of her life, whether these men respected it or not. The moment balanced on the edge of transformation, with the CEO humbled, the onlookers stunned, and Mara standing in the exact center of a story she never asked to be part of, yet she remained unwavering because she had learned long ago that dignity was not something others bestowed, but something she protected fiercely every day. And though none of them realized it yet, this encounter was far from over, because the truth behind her fluency, her past, and the powerful reason she walked away from a career far beyond their assumptions was about to surface in ways that would change far more than just the dynamic inside this luxurious dining room. The CEO's advisors shifted nervously as Mara stood in quiet composure, and the faint tremor in the air suggested the moment was teetering toward a deeper revelation that none of them were prepared to face. Yet she remained centered as though she had spent a lifetime navigating rooms where power often disguised itself as entitlement. The restaurant's ambient noise swelled and softened like a tide unsure of its direction, while several diners leaned subtly toward the unfolding exchange, sensing that something meaningful was still hidden beneath the surface of this unexpected confrontation. The CEO's gaze lingered on Mara with a strange mixture of unease and curiosity, almost as if he were searching for some missing detail that might explain the calm confidence she carried so effortlessly despite standing alone before a table of influential executives accustomed to having command over every space they entered. His voice, once sharp with the casual cruelty of unchecked authority, softened into something nearly tentative as he asked whether she had worked in government or intelligence, though his tone betrayed an underlying fear that her presence in this restaurant might expose his own unfamiliarity with the worlds she had quietly traversed. Mara hesitated only a moment, considering how much she owed these men who had mocked her without hesitation, and she chose to reveal the part of her story that had shaped her most deeply without surrendering every detail to their sudden fascination, because she understood that vulnerability was a gift she was not obligated to give freely. She explained that many years ago she had volunteered with a nonprofit serving immigrant families who struggled to navigate complex systems in a language they barely understood, and that her fluency had grown not from textbooks, but from countless nights translating medical forms, legal documents, and desperate pleas that carried the weight of survival in every syllable. As she spoke, the executive's expressions shifted from skeptical interest to reluctant respect, realizing that her skill represented not only linguistic competency, but a lifetime of compassion forged through helping forgotten people whose stories rarely mattered to those in positions of wealth and influence, and the CEO's eyes narrowed with the dawning awareness that he had misjudged her character on a scale far larger than he intended. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table in a posture that suggested genuine engagement rather than dominance, and he asked softly whether she had ever considered returning to the work she once did, though the question carried more personal curiosity than professional motivation. Mara explained that she had stepped away from her previous life, not by choice but necessity, because her husband's illness had consumed both their savings and her emotional reserves, leaving her to rebuild her world, piece by piece, through jobs that offered stability rather than prestige, and she spoke with a solemn steadiness that made several of the executives lower their eyes in sympathetic discomfort. The CEO blinked slowly as if the weight of her quiet resilience settled onto him like a burden he suddenly felt responsible for acknowledging, and he opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a commotion emerging near the host stand behind them. A young busboy, barely older than 19, stood frozen near a tray of dropped glasses while a demanding customer berated him loudly for the minor accident, his voice rising in sharp, humiliating bursts that echoed across the dining room and caused several diners to cringe with second-hand embarrassment. The boy's breathing quickened visibly as he stumbled over apologies, his accent thick with fear and unfamiliar English, and the older man towered over him with the suffocating air of someone confident that no one would intervene on behalf of a trembling worker, with little command over the language being used to shame him. Before the CEO or any of his advisors could react, Mara stepped forward with graceful certainty, moving toward the scene with the ease of someone who had spent her life diffusing fragile situations that could break a person's spirit if left unattended, and the entire dining room seemed to hold its breath again as she approached the frightened young employee. She spoke in calm, fluent Arabic that wrapped around the boy like a warm, protective shield, reassuring him that accidents were human and reminding him gently that he was not alone, and the relief on his face was immediate as his shoulders sagged with gratitude rather than fear. Her voice shifted seamlessly into English as she addressed the irate customer with unwavering politeness, but there was an undeniable firmness beneath her words that asserted dignity without aggression, and she calmly explained that the staff would replace the broken items and ensure his order was prioritized, leaving him no room to continue his tirade without appearing unreasonably cruel. The customer's face flushed with embarrassed recognition that he had been witnessed by an entire room, and he muttered an awkward apology before sinking back into his seat, suddenly humbled by the quiet authority radiating from a woman he had likely overlooked upon entering. The young busboy murmured his thanks in Arabic through a wavering voice that trembled with relief, and Mara placed a reassuring hand on his arm before sending him back to his duties with the steadying grace of someone who understood how fragile confidence could be when shaped by new languages in foreign places. For the first time since the evening's tension began, the dining room shifted not with shock but admiration, and several employees watched her with newfound respect as though seeing her for the very first time. When Mara returned to the CEO's table, she found every executive staring at her in stunned silence, their earlier arrogance dissolved by the living demonstration of the compassion and strength that had defined her life long before any of them had entered this restaurant tonight. The CEO rose slightly from his chair, not in dominance but acknowledgement, and he looked at her with an expression that blended remorse, intrigue, and a dawning recognition that her presence in this room might be far more significant than he could have imagined. What none of them realized yet, though they sensed it deep in the shifting air, was that this single act of kindness had opened a door into her past that could no longer remain partially closed, and the truth waiting behind it carried implications that would soon reach far beyond the walls of this quiet Manhattan dining room. The CEO watched Mara return to the table with a measured stillness, as though her brief intervention across the dining room had shifted something far more fragile than the mood, and the subtle awe in the eyes of his advisors revealed their dawning awareness that the quiet waitress they had mocked possessed a presence capable of disarming conflict with nothing more than calm words and unwavering dignity. The soft lighting from the chandelier glimmered across the polished tableware as the room regained its rhythm, yet the CEO's gaze remained fixed on Mara with an intensity that suggested he was wrestling with questions he could no longer contain, each one circling around her, like orbiting satellites drawn irresistibly toward gravity they did not fully understand. He cleared his throat, trying to reclaim a semblance of composure, though the forced professionalism in his voice betrayed the curiosity simmering beneath it, and he asked whether she had spent time in the Middle East, choosing his words carefully as if afraid of crossing a boundary she had not invited him to approach. Mara's eyes softened slightly, not with warmth but with the quiet poise of someone accustomed to inquiries that arrived wrapped in suspicion or fascination, and she responded that her experiences came from many places and many years, a phrase that seemed to deepen the mystery rather than clarify it. The CEO leaned forward with the kind of measured fascination reserved for puzzles that defied easy solutions, and he asked whether she had worked with humanitarian organizations abroad, though his voice carried more reverence than demand, as if he were gently probing the edges of her story without daring to intrude too abruptly. Mara paused, allowing the silence to stretch just enough to remind him that curiosity did not grant entitlement, and she chose her next words with meticulous care, explaining that she had worked in communities where language barriers created dangers far more severe than awkward misunderstandings, shaping her into someone who could not walk away from people who depended on her calm guidance. Her explanation, though vague, radiated a quiet courage that silenced the table into reflective stillness, and the CEO's eyes flickered with something unfamiliar, perhaps respect, or perhaps guilt, because her story underscored a truth he had long avoided, acknowledging that compassion required a kind of strength he rarely exercised in his corporate corridors of glass and steel. One of the advisors leaned back with a contemplative expression, clearly recognizing that Mara's presence challenged every assumption they had projected onto her, and the shifting atmosphere around the table revealed a fragile blend of humility, admiration, and unease. The CEO, emboldened by a curiosity he could no longer suppress, allowed his gaze to linger on the faint lines around Mara's eyes, noticing how they hinted at a life marked by endurance rather than leisure, and he asked softly whether she had ever considered returning to translation work, his voice carrying an undercurrent that suggested he was trying to understand something deeper than her resume. Mara met his eyes with a level steadiness that unsettled him slightly, because she seemed capable of reading the intentions behind his words as easily as she read the expressions of frightened immigrants decades earlier. She explained that life had shifted in ways she had not planned, forcing her to prioritize family and survival rather than ambition or recognition, and the simplicity of her words cast a shadow over the table as the executives realized how profoundly her narrative differed from their polished success stories. The CEO exhaled slowly as though absorbing the weight of the sacrifices she mentioned, and he asked almost hesitantly whether she had ever regretted stepping away from her previous path, though the question sounded more personal than professional, as if he feared the answer might reveal the hollowness of his own pursuits. Mara shook her head gently, explaining that regret had little meaning in a life guided by necessity, because she had long understood that choosing responsibility over prestige was not a sign of failure, but evidence of a heart anchored in something greater than personal gain. Her voice carried a quiet resolve that permeated the table, and the CEO felt an unexpected tug beneath his ribs, as though her words were dismantling the glossy facade he had built around his own accomplishments, exposing the loneliness tucked beneath his relentless ambition. For a moment, the CEO's eyes softened in a way his advisors rarely witnessed, revealing a flicker of vulnerability he seemed uncertain how to conceal, and he asked whether she believed people could change, after recognizing the flaws in their perspective, though he phrased it as a general philosophical query rather than an admission of personal guilt. Mara regarded him for a long moment, noting the tension in his jaw and the stiffness in his posture, and she replied that change was possible for anyone willing to confront the truth about themselves, a statement that seemed to pierce directly through the CEO's guarded composure. A ripple of silence moved across the table as her words lingered like a quiet echo, and several executives shifted in their seats with subtle discomfort, sensing the unspoken exchange between the two. had drifted into a realm far more intimate than power dynamics or public embarrassment. The CEO glanced down at his hands, briefly losing his commanding presence, and when he finally looked up again, his eyes carried a sincerity that startled even him, as though the woman standing before him had peeled back a layer of his identity he had forgotten existed. He reached for his water glass with a steady but contemplative hand, and when he spoke again, his tone had transformed into something almost gentle, asking whether she would be willing to discuss her background further after her shift, though he quickly added that she was under no obligation to share more than she wished. Mara considered his request with measured caution, recognizing the sincerity in his voice, yet understanding the delicate balance between curiosity and intrusion, and she responded that conversation was always possible so long as respect remained at the center of it. The CEO nodded with visible relief, his expression shifting from eager inquiry to tempered humility, and the table quietly recalibrated itself around the unexpected connection forming between a powerful executive and an older waitress whose life story had begun unraveling the unspoken assumptions that governed this pristine dining room. The subtle electricity in the air hinted at a new alignment of forces, a shift in attention, authority, and emotional gravity, and though no one dared name it aloud, every person at the table sensed that the dynamic had irrevocably changed. What none of them realized, however, was that this delicate equilibrium was only the beginning, and the questions stirring within the CEO's conscience would soon collide with truths in Mara's past that neither compassion nor curiosity alone could easily contain. The atmosphere around the table shifted again as Mara stepped back toward her quiet corner of the dining room, yet the CEO continued watching her with an expression that blended concern, curiosity, and an emerging sense of responsibility he seemed unsure how to articulate, and his advisors exchanged uneasy glances as though they sensed a new tension brewing beneath the surface that had nothing to do with language or pride. The chandelier's soft glow flickered across the room in warm reflections, but the CEO's gaze carried a shadowed edge now, as if her story had awakened something inside him that made the polished stability of the dining room feel strangely fragile. One advisor leaned closer to whisper that their meeting schedule was slipping, but the CEO waved him off absently, his eyes still following Mara, with an intensity that suggested he had begun piecing together a puzzle he did not yet fully understand, and the fragmented picture forming in his mind unsettled him more than he cared to admit. There was something hauntingly familiar about the way she carried herself, something in her voice, her resolve, and the way she seemed to understand people before they understood themselves, and he felt an unfamiliar knot tightening in his chest, as though the past had begun tugging mercilessly at the edges of his composure. The tension grew sharper when a second advisor, a woman with sleek dark hair pulled into a precise twist, leaned toward him with an expression that bordered on alarm and told him that she recognized Mara's accent as belonging to a specific region involved in a series of high-stakes negotiations several years earlier, negotiations the CEO himself had overseen during a volatile period that nearly derailed his company's trajectory entirely. Her voice dropped even lower when she suggested that if Mara had indeed been involved in any part of that process, even peripherally, the implications for their current expansion strategy could be far more significant than a simple linguistic coincidence, and the CEO felt a cold ripple travel down his spine in response. He forced his breathing to steady as he processed her words, recalling countless boardroom disputes, tense government meetings, and delicate cross-border partnerships that had required precision, secrecy, and unwavering control. Yet something in this moment made him question whether he had overlooked someone essential within those tangled histories. Mara's sentence had not merely been well pronounced, it had carried the subtle cadence of someone who had lived within that region's communities, absorbing the rhythms and inflections that only came from long, immersive exposure. And the possibility that she possessed insight into political or cultural nuances he had once considered proprietary felt both unsettling and oddly humbling. As the CEO wrestled with these thoughts, Another advisor mentioned that they were scheduled to meet investors from the same region next week, and that any unexpected revelation about his past dealings could jeopardize the fragile trust required for the multi-billion-dollar merger in progress, causing the CEO to stiffen in his chair with the dawning awareness that Mara's presence represented more than a challenge to his ego. It represented a potential threat to the very stability of his next venture. His eyes sharpened as he considered this new layer of risk, and despite his earlier remorse, a flicker of self-protective instinct threaded through his expression as he wondered whether her past could collide with his future in ways he was not prepared to manage. Across the room, Mara continued her work with quiet efficiency, unaware of the storm gathering at the table behind her, though her posture carried the subtle wariness of someone who had spent her life navigating people whose power often manifested through manipulation or fear, and every gesture she made mirrored the steady discipline she had built across decades of responsibility and hardship. The CEO watched her carefully, noticing the resilience etched into her movements, and wondering how much of her strength had been forged through personal battles he could not begin to fathom. And the more he observed her, the clearer it became that she carried stories capable of changing the trajectory of more than one life in this room. His fingers tightened slightly along the edge of his glass as a troubling thought surfaced. If Mara truly possessed insights into the region where his company sought expansion, and if any part of her past intersected with sensitive events he had carefully buried beneath layers of corporate strategy, she could unintentionally unravel the delicate narrative that protected him from scrutiny, and he felt a wave of unease ripple through him with unsettling force. An advisor leaned in again, whispering that they should perhaps gather more information discreetly before discussing any deals further, because understanding Mara's background might prove essential before stepping into negotiations that required flawless cultural understanding and absolute trust. The CEO nodded with a conflicted expression, torn between the dawning respect he felt for the woman who had humbled him and the instinctive pull of self-preservation born from years of navigating cutthroat industries where vulnerability often proved fatal, and he swallowed hard as his mind churned with questions he had never expected to ask about a waitress he had mocked only an hour earlier. As he continued watching her, he noticed a faint tremor in her hands when she reached for a tray so subtle most would miss it, and he wondered whether it came from exhaustion, stress, or the remnants of a past that still clung to her bones like an old and familiar ache. The chandelier lights shimmered across the marble floor as the CEO leaned back, his breath unsteady, finally recognizing the gravity of this moment. Mara was no longer simply a waitress he had underestimated, but a woman whose unexpected skills and undisclosed history could influence matters far larger than the delicate hierarchy of this dining room, and the stakes of their encounter had just expanded into territory he could neither predict nor control. The advisors exchanged uneasy glances as they sensed the shift in his posture, realizing that the situation had become far more complex than a simple power imbalance, and an unspoken tension settled over the table like a heavy curtain preparing to fall. Yet, even as uncertainty twisted through the CEO's thoughts, he felt an undeniable pull toward the truth that Mara carried quietly within her. And he knew that whatever came next would depend not on his authority or wealth, but on his willingness to confront the uncomfortable reality that his past choices and her hidden history were on a collision course. He could no longer avoid. The tension that had settled over the dining room deepened further when the CEO's senior advisor, a man whose expression rarely softened even in the most delicate negotiations, rose from his chair with a calculated air that immediately unsettled several people at the table, as though he were preparing to reassert control in a situation slipping rapidly beyond their collective grasp. His posture carried the rigid confidence of someone accustomed to operating behind closed doors where aggression could be disguised as professionalism, and he moved toward Mara with the practiced precision of a man who believed intimidation worked best when delivered with a polite smile and a sharpened tone. Mara felt his approach before she fully registered his presence, sensing the shift in the atmosphere the way people who have lived through conflict can instinctively recognize danger and she set down the tray in her hands with careful deliberation, turning slowly as though preparing herself for an encounter she had hoped to avoid. The advisor's voice emerged smooth and deceptively polite as he asked her to step aside for a brief conversation, though his eyes carried a cold calculation that exposed his true intention: to probe her background, assess her motives, and determine whether she posed a threat to the fragile equilibrium of their impending deal. The CEO watched from the table, uncertain whether he should intervene, though the tightening of his jaw revealed his growing discomfort with the advisor's abrupt escalation, and he leaned forward slightly, as if ready to stop the interaction if it crossed a boundary he could no longer justify. The advisor, however, paid no attention to his employer's shifting expression, instead focusing entirely on Mara with the intensity of someone gathering information not for clarity but for leverage, and his next question emerged sharper than the first, as he asked whether she had ever worked with political intermediaries in the region known for its volatile alliances. Mara answered calmly that her work had always centered on helping families navigate life in unfamiliar places rather than influencing political agendas. But the advisor's skepticism only seemed to grow as he pressed further, asking how she learned the dialect so fluently, and whether she had connections that might interfere with the company's confidential negotiations. His words were wrapped in the thin veneer of professional concern, yet beneath them pulsed a barely veiled threat, a warning that her presence could become a liability if she withheld anything that might affect the outcome of their upcoming international mergers. The dining room began to shift around them as staff paused mid-task to observe the tense exchange, and several diners watched with a blend of curiosity and discomfort, sensing that the advisor's interrogation carried an edge that felt profoundly inappropriate for a setting meant to offer dignity to every person within it. Mara held her ground with quiet strength, explaining that her past did not intersect with the corporate or political realms they occupied, but the advisor stepped closer with a dismissive smirk, insisting that people who claim neutrality often have the most to hide, and the implication sank like a heavy shadow across the space between them. The CEO's expression darkened visibly as he realized the conversation had veered into cruelty disguised as caution, and he rose abruptly from his chair with a force that startled several of his colleagues, though the advisor remained oblivious to the shift in authority behind him. Mara's voice remained soft yet steady as she responded that her life had been defined by service, empathy, and duty to those who needed her help, which made the accusation of hidden motives feel both insulting and painfully familiar, echoing the way she had once been treated by people who misunderstood the nature of the work she had committed her life to. The advisor crossed his arms and tilted his chin slightly, adopting a posture that projected superiority rather than reason, and he leaned forward to tell her that people with mysterious pasts often stumble into matters they do not understand, implying that her presence in this restaurant could potentially undermine negotiations she knew nothing about. Mara felt the sting of his words, but refused to let them shake her composure, and she quietly explained that the lives she had touched and the families she had supported mattered far more than the corporate fears he was projecting onto her, because true threats rarely came from those who spent their lives offering kindness rather than wielding power. Before the advisor could continue, the CEO stepped forward with a sharp command in his voice that froze the room instantly, telling the advisor to stop immediately, because the discussion had crossed far beyond professionalism into territory bordering on humiliation. The advisor turned in surprise, his confidence wilting for a fleeting second as he saw the frustration etched across the CEO's face, yet he attempted to justify his behavior by claiming he was acting in the company's best interest, insisting that understanding Mara's background was essential to protecting the integrity of their negotiations. The CEO's jaw tightened as he informed the advisor that intention did not excuse disrespect, especially toward someone whose only role in this room had been to serve them with dignity and patience, and his voice carried a simmering anger that signaled the beginning of a fracture in the hierarchy that had governed their interactions throughout the evening. Mara watched quietly, feeling the weight of the moment settle around them like thick fog, and she realized that the CEO was not merely defending her from further embarrassment, but confronting a deeper truth. He had long avoided the truth that power often revealed its character in how it treated those who held none. The advisor attempted one final protest, suggesting that Mara's fluency and composure indicated she was far more than a simple waitress. But the CEO silenced him with a single pointed statement. "That doesn't give you permission to treat her as less than human." His words rang through the dining room with a conviction that surprised even him, and several diners shifted in their seats, with subtle admiration for the rare moment of accountability unfolding before them. Mara inhaled slowly as the room settled into an uneasy quiet, and the CEO turned back to her with an expression softened by remorse and tempered by humility, acknowledging that she had endured more than anyone in her position should ever have to face. Yet beneath his apology lingered a deeper worry, a fear that the advisor's suspicions, though delivered with cruelty, might not be entirely unfounded, and that the truths Mara carried within her could still collide with the precarious negotiations he had spent years constructing. The moment balanced precariously between tension and revelation, and although the advisor stepped back in reluctant silence, the undercurrent of danger remained. Because the question he had raised, however clumsily, had unearthed a new complication that neither Mara nor the CEO could ignore in the hours ahead. The dining room remained suspended in a fragile quiet after the advisor stepped back, and Mara felt the weight of 100 eyes resting on her with a mixture of sympathy, curiosity, and unspoken expectation. As though the entire restaurant had recognized, she stood at the center of a storm. She never invited yet, now had no choice but to navigate with the same resilience that had shaped her life. The CEO exhaled slowly while steadying himself against the back of a chair, and his features held an expression of tension carved from equal parts guilt and awakening, suggesting he understood that his earlier behavior had opened a gateway to conflict that now demanded a reckoning neither of them could delay any longer. He took a careful step toward Mara, creating a subtle shift in the room as though everyone sensed the approach of a pivotal moment, and his voice emerged with a cautious hesitation that conveyed both vulnerability and a desperate need for clarity. "I need to understand what just happened," he murmured, keeping his tone low enough to avoid drawing more attention, though the intensity in his eyes revealed the urgency pulsing behind the question. Mara met his gaze with a calm steadiness shaped by years of guiding frightened people through bureaucratic labyrinths, and she answered that nothing unusual had happened except an unnecessary escalation fueled by fear rather than truth. The CEO seemed caught between acceptance and denial, and he shook his head slowly as though trying to dislodge lingering doubts seeded by his advisor's accusations, his expression tightening with the realization that he might have unknowingly contributed to a chain of events capable of causing Mara real emotional harm. He asked whether she had felt threatened by the advisor's interrogation, though the anxious tremor beneath his words revealed that the question was less about her safety and more about his need to confront the growing possibility that he had allowed his team's unchecked aggression to cross a boundary he deeply regretted. Mara explained in her steady voice that she had encountered far more intimidating situations during the years she spent translating for families at risk of losing everything. Yet she admitted that cruelty delivered under the guise of professionalism always left a distinct sting, especially when directed at those who lacked the power to defend themselves. Her honesty struck the CEO with unexpected force, and he lowered his gaze for a moment as though absorbing the heavy truth hidden in her measured words, then lifted his head with a newfound determination that seemed to shape the air around him like an emerging storm. He turned abruptly toward the advisor who had interrogated her, and the temperature of his voice dropped several degrees when he said that intimidation, however cleverly disguised, had no place in his leadership, especially when directed at someone who had demonstrated more integrity in one evening than many people in their corporate circles managed to display in a lifetime. The advisor stiffened, narrowing his eyes slightly as though preparing a defense, but the CEO cut him off sharply by stepping closer and clarifying that he expected loyalty, not cruelty, and that fear-driven speculation could not justify stripping a hard-working woman of her dignity. Several diners exchanged glances as the confrontation intensified, recognizing the rare sight of a powerful executive confronting one of his own in public, and the tension rippled outward like a vibration through the polished floor, as though the entire restaurant had become a witness to a conflict that transcended simple disagreement. The advisor responded with controlled frustration, insisting that his actions had been motivated solely by protecting the company's interests, and he suggested that the CEO's growing sympathy for Mara had clouded his judgment during a critical moment, planting a subtle seed of distrust meant to undermine the CEO's newfound introspection. Mara felt a subtle shiver course through the room as the advisor's insinuation hung in the air, and she recognized the tactic all too well, the deliberate reframing of empathy as weakness, a strategy often used by people who feared losing control when others began questioning their authority. The CEO inhaled slowly before replying with a quiet but cutting precision, telling the advisor that acknowledging someone's humanity was not a liability but an obligation, especially when his own arrogance had contributed to the situation spiraling beyond professional boundaries. The advisor's jaw clenched as he attempted to salvage his position by pointing out that Mara's fluency and composure suggested she possessed knowledge that could jeopardize the company's upcoming negotiations. Yet Mara sensed the dangerously shifting tension in the room and stepped forward with a steadiness that immediately disrupted the rising conflict. She told the advisor in a calm, unwavering tone that she held no interest in the corporate secrets they guarded so fiercely, because her life revolved around responsibilities far more important than financial empires or strategic alliances. Her voice softened slightly as she added that she had spent her years offering support to people who had nothing left except hope, compassion, and the fragile trust placed in whoever spoke on their behalf, and she reminded them gently that not every skill existed to advance corporate agendas or personal survival. The CEO's expression softened as her words filled the room with a quiet dignity, and he stepped closer with a sincerity that contrasted sharply with the advisor's growing agitation, telling her that he believed her without question and thanking her for handling the confrontation with a grace he found rare among people under far less pressure. The advisor, however, was not finished, and he challenged the CEO directly by questioning whether he intended to allow sentimentality to cloud his decision-making during a period when the company could not afford even minor miscalculations, especially with an international deal resting on tensions already stretched thin by political complexities. His criticism cut deeper than intended, revealing a fracture in his respect for the CEO's authority, and several onlookers sensed the confrontation slipping from controlled disagreement into something raw and dangerously personal. The CEO straightened to his full height, his voice firm as he reminded the advisor that strength did not come from crushing others but from recognizing when humility was required, especially in the presence of someone who had demonstrated more courage than any of the suits seated at their table. The advisor flushed with anger yet refrained from further comment, realizing he had pushed too far, and the room settled into a tense quiet as the confrontation finally reached its tipping point. Mara felt the weight of the conflict pressing against her chest, and although the CEO's defense had warmed something fragile inside her, she could not ignore the unsettling truth that lingered at the edges of the moment. The advisor's suspicion, though delivered with cruelty, contained echoes of a reality she could not fully deny, because her past held shadows that could easily collide with the CEO's world in dangerous ways, neither of them yet understood. The air between them hummed with unresolved tension as the advisor returned to his seat, and Mara sensed the beginning of a shift deeper than any confrontation thus far, an inevitable collision of truth, power, and hidden histories that threatened to unravel far more than the fragile peace of this expensive dining room. The uneasy quiet that settled after the confrontation felt heavier than the earlier tension, as though the restaurant itself recognized something irreversible had shifted, and Mara sensed the weight of the moment pressing into her shoulders with a familiar ache she had carried through many years of unspoken burdens. The CEO stood only a few feet away, his posture tense and conflicted, torn between the instinct to protect her from further humiliation and the emerging fear that her past might contain truths capable of reshaping the delicate balance of his world in ways he had not anticipated. Several diners watched with hushed fascination, their conversations fading into soft murmurs as though they understood the scene unfolding, was no longer a simple clash of class or temperament, but the unveiling of something deeper, older, and far more consequential. Mara took a steady breath and lifted her gaze toward the CEO, knowing instinctively that the next words she spoke would define the direction of everything that followed, because truths carried weight, and certain truths, especially those forged in the crucible of conflict, carried consequences that could ripple through people's lives long after the moment passed. The CEO's eyes met hers with a mixture of fear and expectation, and he stepped forward slightly as if bracing himself for impact, the tension in his jaw revealing how desperately he needed clarity to quiet the doubts planted by his advisor's earlier accusations. Before he could speak, one of the younger executives leaned toward the CEO with a barely controlled urgency, whispering that the dialect Mara had used earlier belonged to a highly specific region, one that had been the center of a sensitive humanitarian crisis several years ago, a crisis that his company had attempted to engage with, but ultimately withdrew from after several missteps that had cost them both political leverage and public reputation. His voice trembled as he added that anyone possessing first-hand knowledge of that region's dynamics might hold insights capable of altering the company's future negotiations, and the CEO's expression tightened with dread, as though he realized how precarious his situation had become. Mara watched the shift in their expressions and felt a painful pull in her chest, recognizing that her silence was no longer merely a shield for her own privacy, but an obstacle to the clarity they needed to navigate the conflict brewing beneath the surface, and she understood that withholding her truth would only deepen the suspicion festering within the group. She stepped closer with the quiet determination of someone who had spent years learning when to speak and when to stay silent, and the subtle shift of her posture caught the CEO's attention instantly, drawing the entire table back into stillness. The CEO's eyes searched hers with an unspoken plea, and when he finally found his voice, it emerged as barely more than a whisper, asking whether she had, in fact, been involved in the humanitarian operations surrounding that crisis, though his tone carried none of the advisor's earlier aggression and instead radiated genuine concern. Mara did not answer immediately, choosing instead to draw a slow breath that seemed to pull the entire room into its rhythm, and then she spoke the sentence that cracked open the silence like a fault line breaking across stone. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady but weighted. "I was there when the families fled through the checkpoints your company tried to regulate." The reaction was immediate and seismic. The executives stiffened in their seats, their eyes widening with shock as the ghosts of past negotiations clawed their way back into the present, and the CEO's breath faltered as though the words had struck him at the center of a wound he had spent years pretending no longer existed. A ripple of uneasy whispers swept across nearby tables, though few understood the full significance of her revelation, and the restaurant's comforting hum faded into a tense, suspended quiet that felt on the verge of shattering. The CEO's voice cracked slightly as he asked whether she had seen the consequences of their failed initiative firsthand, and Mara nodded slowly with an expression that held neither anger nor accusation, only the quiet sorrow of someone who had carried the memories of displaced families, frightened children, and the harrowing uncertainty of survival long after the world had moved on from the crisis. She explained that she had spent months helping families navigate the chaos left in the wake of corporate miscalculations, translating stories of loss and desperation into actionable pleas for resources, safety, and compassion pleas that too often went unheard by the powerful voices shaping policy from afar. Her words pierced the CEO with devastating clarity, and he realized that her presence in this dining room was not merely a coincidence or a challenge to his authority, but a direct, tangible reminder of the human cost behind decisions he had once justified as strategic necessities, though now those decisions felt like shadows following him through every polished room he entered. His eyes glistened with something dangerously close to remorse as he asked whether she had blamed him for what happened, and Mara answered that blame had never been her priority, because people in crisis rarely had time to hate those who failed them. They simply needed someone to help them survive the next day. The humility in her voice struck the CEO harder than anger ever could, unraveling the illusions he had used to shield himself from the weight of past mistakes, and he felt a shudder run through him as he recognized that she possessed a strength built not from power or position but from compassion, forged under pressures he had never truly understood. The executives shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that the woman they had dismissed as a simple waitress held more insight into their company's fractured legacy than any spreadsheet or briefing document could ever convey, and several avoided her gaze entirely, unable to confront the moral mirror she represented. Mara's hands trembled slightly as she continued speaking, though her voice remained steady, explaining that she had not come to confront him or expose his past failures, because life had forced her toward survival rather than revenge, and she had long learned that healing required more than anger. It required truth shared at the right moment. She told him that her presence here tonight had been nothing more than coincidence until he turned her into a spectacle, but now she understood that their collision carried significance neither of them could ignore, because the past had a way of resurfacing when the lessons it held remained unfinished. The CEO's face softened into a fragile expression of understanding, and he whispered that he had never expected their worlds to collide in such a way, but Mara simply offered a faint, weary smile that held years of unspoken stories, silently acknowledging that life rarely unfolded according to the comfortable narratives people tried to impose upon it. The dining room lingered in a suspended hush as the truth settled between them, reshaping the power dynamics of the moment with quiet precision, and for the first time since the evening began, the CEO realized that his actions would now be measured not by the executives at his table, but by the woman who had lived through the consequences of his past choices. Her sentence had flipped everything: the tension, the hierarchy, the unspoken assumptions, and the fragile illusion of distance he had relied on to protect himself from the truth. And beneath the shimmering chandelier, as the weight of her words echoed through the room, the CEO felt something shift deep within him, a recognition that the story unfolding tonight held the power to redeem or destroy him, depending entirely on how he chose to face the truth she had finally spoken aloud. The CEO stood absolutely still as Mara's revelation settled into the center of the room like a dropped stone, sending thousands of invisible ripples through every corner of the restaurant, and the expression that spread across his face was one of dawning terror, as if her words had unearthed a part of his past. He had spent years trying to bury beneath polished boardrooms and carefully curated narratives. His advisors exchanged quick, alarmed glances, each one realizing that her presence no longer represented a small embarrassment or a curious anomaly, but a potential threat to the foundation upon which their upcoming negotiations, and perhaps even the CEO's public reputation, depended. Several tables nearby shifted uneasily, sensing a tension too heavy to ignore, and the soft hum of conversation faded into scattered pockets of murmurs, as diners recognized that something far more serious than a corporate dinner was unfolding before them. The CEO's posture stiffened as he tried to regain control over his breathing, but the vulnerability in his eyes betrayed a man grappling with the unexpected collapse of the distance he had placed between his wealth-driven world and the human consequences of decisions he had once considered unavoidable. The first advisor stepped closer with visible urgency, leaning toward the CEO with a whisper so sharp it seemed to slice the air, insisting that they needed to leave immediately before Mara revealed anything more that could compromise their position in the upcoming merger. The CEO didn't respond right away, caught between the instinct to protect his own interests and the moral gravity of the truth Mara had finally voiced, and his expression flickered between fear, responsibility, and something that resembled quiet shame. Before he could speak, the restaurant doors opened with a soft but deliberate swing, and two sharply dressed security contractors, men clearly hired for discreet protection rather than public intimidation, stepped into the room with synchronized precision, scanning the environment with practiced vigilance as though responding to an unspoken signal. Their arrival sent a collective shiver across the diners, who instinctively straightened in their seats, unsure whether the tension now unfolding was about to escalate into something far more volatile. Mara recognized the type immediately. Their movements carried the same controlled alertness she had seen countless times in the field, and the familiar chill that traveled down her spine reminded her that powerful people rarely faced uncomfortable truths without seeking to reassert control through whatever means remained available to them. The CEO turned abruptly when he noticed the security team approaching, and his expression shifted from shock to alarm as he raised a hand to stop them, though they continued forward until standing a respectful distance behind his chair. The younger executive whispered anxiously that someone from the company's crisis division must have been monitoring the CEO's location tonight, and that Mara's revelation had likely triggered internal alerts designed to protect him from potential leaks or confrontations, causing the CEO to pale further as he realized the situation had spiraled beyond what he could quietly contain. His breath hitched slightly as the lead contractor asked whether he needed an extraction or a secure transport out of the building, and the CEO shook his head with a visible tremor, aware that fleeing now would confirm every suspicion Mara's sentence had ignited. The advisor who had interrogated Mara earlier seized the moment to press his agenda, stepping forward with a cold edge in his voice as he suggested that they remove any risks from the premises, his eyes cutting toward Mara with an implication so chilling that several diners gasped softly despite not knowing the full context of the unfolding situation. Mara's pulse quickened, not from fear but from the familiar recognition of people who used authority as a weapon, and she lifted her chin slightly in a silent declaration that she would not shrink beneath the threat simmering beneath the advisor's carefully chosen words. The CEO snapped sharply at the advisor, telling him in a low, controlled voice that no one was to touch her, and his words carried an intensity that silenced the room more effectively than any shout could have done, though the glimmer of fear behind his eyes revealed how close he felt to losing control of the narrative entirely. The advisors exchanged worried looks, realizing that the CEO's protective stance placed them in dangerous territory where emotional judgment might override strategic caution, yet none dared challenge him further as the security contractors waited in tense readiness. Mara felt the shifting currents of power pressing around her like an invisible tide, and although she had done nothing except speak the truth, she understood that powerful men often responded unpredictably when the consequences of their past actions confronted them in human form. She steadied her breath, reminding herself of the countless families she had stood beside during far more dangerous confrontations, and her voice remained calm as she told the CEO that she had no interest in exposing him or jeopardizing his livelihood, because her purpose had always been to help rather than harm. Her words, delivered with quiet strength, caused the CEO's composure to crack further as he recognized the grace embedded within her restraint, and he stepped closer with a tremor in his voice as he asked whether she had truly witnessed the fallout of his company's decisions during the crisis. She answered with a slow, deliberate nod, explaining that she had spent her days translating for families who had lost everything during the upheaval, and that she had held screaming children, broken parents, and weary elders whose stories would never appear in polished corporate reports. The CEO's face contorted with a mix of remorse and disbelief, and for a moment he looked less like a powerful executive and more like a man staring into the reflection of his own failures, realizing that the consequences he had long categorized as regrettable necessities were in fact human tragedies, carried by people like Mara, long after the world moved on. His voice cracked again as he whispered that he hadn't known the full extent of the damage, and Mara replied gently that people seldom understand the true cost of their distance from suffering until it stands inches away from them, clothed not in theories or statistics, but in lived memories. The security contractors shifted subtly as the CEO's emotional vulnerability intensified, clearly uncertain whether their role required intervention or simply watchful presence, yet the CEO barely noticed them as he reached for the back of a chair to steady himself, overwhelmed by the collision of past choices with present truth. Several onlookers watched with wide eyes, moved by the raw exposure of a man forced to confront the humanity he had once overlooked, and the room hummed with an unspoken understanding that power had begun shifting irrevocably toward the woman whose voice had dismantled an empire of denial with a single sentence. In that moment, the CEO realized something profound, that the truth Mara carried could not be neutralized by security, advisors, or fear tactics, because her power came not from position but from moral clarity, and every attempt to reassert dominance only underscored the vast difference between authority built on wealth and authority built on lived sacrifice. And as he looked into her steady gaze beneath the shimmering chandelier, he understood that the path forward would require choices more difficult than any merger or negotiation he had ever faced, choices shaped not by profit margins, but by the truth she had finally forced him to confront. The room remained suspended in breathless stillness as the CEO steadied himself against the weight of Mara's revelation, and a strange sense of inevitability settled over the space, as though the truth waiting beneath the surface had always been destined to rise the moment someone dared speak it aloud. The advisors sat rigidly in their chairs, each one battling the uncomfortable realization that the carefully constructed facade surrounding their company's past decisions had begun to crack in the presence of a woman who carried nothing except lived experience, quiet authority, and memories too heavy to soften. The chandelier's warm light flickered across Mara's face, illuminating the subtle tension in her expression as she prepared to share the part of her story she had avoided for years, knowing that once spoken, the truth would forever alter the balance of power in this room. The CEO swallowed hard before asking her to explain what she had witnessed during the crisis that intersected so painfully with the history of his company, and his voice trembled not from anger, but from a growing fear that her memories might reveal consequences far more devastating than the sanitized reports he had once approved. Mara took a slow, deliberate breath, not certain she possessed the strength to return to the spaces that had nearly consumed her years ago. The CEO nodded gently, acknowledging her hesitation without argument, and he assured her that the offer was not intended to pressure her, but to honor the extraordinary resilience she had demonstrated throughout her life. He added that if she chose not to accept a position within the company, he would still commit substantial resources to support the communities she cared about, ensuring that the mistakes of his past would never again be repeated under his leadership. His words resonated across the room with a sincerity that caused several diners to bow their heads in quiet reflection, and Mara felt a tear slip down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the unexpected recognition that the truth she had carried for so long had finally found a place where it could spark meaningful change. She thanked the CEO softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, and told him that she needed time to consider the offer carefully because the choice mattered not only to her, but to the countless lives she might affect by stepping back into a world she once left behind. The CEO accepted her answer with a respectful nod, and for the first time since the evening began, he extended his hand, not as a gesture of authority, but as a symbol of equality, gratitude, and sincere intention. Mara hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his, and the brief contact carried the weight of a promise, neither fully understood yet both silently acknowledged that justice, however delayed, had finally begun to weave its way into their shared story. And as the room exhaled in collective relief, it became clear that the confrontation, which began with mockery, had transformed into a moment of accountability, humility, and the first fragile step toward redemption, one that would soon shape the fate of everyone involved. The restaurant slowly returned to its natural rhythm as the weight of the evening's revelations settled into a quieter, gentler stillness, and Mara stood at the center of it with the tired grace of someone who had survived a storm she never wished to summon, yet faced with unshakable resolve. The CEO released her hand with a soft exhale, and for the first time since she had approached his table, he looked at her not as a waitress or a symbol of past mistakes, but as a human being whose integrity had reshaped every assumption he carried into the room. He stepped back with a humility that astonished the advisors watching nearby, and his voice softened as he told her that whatever choice she made about the offer, he intended to restructure the company's humanitarian approach entirely, ensuring it aligned not with profit-driven strategy, but with the compassion she had embodied so effortlessly throughout their painful exchange. Mara listened quietly, sensing the sincerity beneath his words, and she felt a cautious warmth stir inside her, a warmth she had not felt in years, the kind that comes when a burden long carried is finally understood by someone capable of easing it. She told him gently that change rooted in guilt rarely lasted, and that true transformation required the courage to face the most uncomfortable truths. Yet she acknowledged that the humility he had shown tonight proved he was capable of more than the cold ambition people accused him of. The CEO received her words with a grateful nod and admitted that he had spent much of his life believing leadership meant controlling outcomes rather than owning mistakes. Yet tonight had revealed that strength was measured not by influence but by the ability to listen to voices he had once overlooked. Several diners rose quietly to leave, offering Mara small nods of admiration as they passed, their eyes reflecting the profound respect she had earned, simply by standing firm in her truth without bitterness or cruelty, and the soft murmur of their appreciation brought a subtle warmth to the space that softened the earlier tension. The security contractors stepped aside as the CEO dismissed them with a firm yet calm gesture, signaling that no further intervention was needed, and even they seemed moved by the transformation unfolding before them. Mara excused herself to return to her duties, though the CEO insisted she take the remainder of the evening off with full pay, and she accepted with a grateful smile, because exhaustion had begun to seep into her bones after carrying the emotional weight of memories she rarely revisited. As she walked toward the back corridor, the CEO called after her gently, promising that no matter what path she chose, her story would never again be diminished or ignored, and she paused only long enough to nod before continuing on with the steady steps of someone reclaiming her peace inch by inch. When she reached the quiet break room, she finally allowed herself a long breath, feeling the tremble in her hands subside as the noise of the dining room faded behind her, and she realized that although the evening had unearthed painful memories, it had also given her something she had not expected: closure. She understood now that the past no longer defined her, and that the compassion she had carried into every difficult moment of her life remained intact, unbroken by time or circumstance. Back in the dining room, the CEO sat heavily in his chair, visibly shaken yet strangely unburdened, and his advisors watched him with a mixture of confusion and respect, realizing that tonight had marked the beginning of a profound shift in the man they thought they understood. He told them quietly that tomorrow would bring a new direction for the company, one shaped not by ambition but by accountability, and though several advisors exchanged wary glances, none dared challenge him after witnessing the transformation Mara had sparked. As Mara gathered her belongings to head home, she stepped outside into the cool night air, letting the city's distant hum soothe the remnants of tension clinging to her thoughts, and she realized that despite the emotional turmoil of the evening, she felt lighter than she had in years. The stars above Manhattan glimmered faintly against the skyline, and she allowed herself a soft smile, knowing that life had granted her a rare moment of justice, quiet, dignified, and utterly human. And though she did not know what choice she would make in the days ahead, she understood that the redemption unfolding tonight did not belong solely to the CEO or the company he led. It belonged to her as well, because she had reclaimed her story, spoken her truth, and walked away with the certainty that compassion once offered without expectation could ripple through the world in ways no one could predict.